right, I think we're rolling then. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. It's really nice to be here, sort of. But let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and start the process here. So what I'll be sharing with you today is my vision for combined, integrated, unified toward a more coherent clinical psychology in the 21st century. I'm honored to be part of this conference. I've enjoyed my conversations with Mark over many years, and Sue and Caroline. I'm really glad that we got a chance to chat. So, you know, I love the idea of the conference in terms of bind, join, and be united as one. I think that's beautiful. And it certainly speaks to my heart, and it speaks to my passions over the course of my career and its exploration. I'm looking out over at least a picture of Christchurch. And I will say at least the commute hasn't been bad, so that's a positive. And I appreciate that you guys are having a conference there. That's what it likes to look like, a lot of people in one room. I haven't seen that in a while. You know, I am happy to be at a beautiful place myself. This is James Madison University at dusk. And so we're actually, many of us are very fortunate to be in the places that we are. So thank you so much. It's very, very enjoyable to have this opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts. So I'd like to just start by getting clear about why I titled my talk, what I did, combined, integrated, unified, and we'll start with combined. What does that mean? Combined in our language means combined across the practice areas of psychology. And the practice areas of psychology in the United States are clinical, counseling, and school. And so when I say toward a coherent clinical psychology in the 21st century, I actually should be clear. I mean that with a little c, not a capital C, because actually what we're exploring in James Madison University's combined integrated doctoral program is a combined integrated approach. And that trains at the heart of the practice areas. And what we really are affording is a coherent, integrated identity of a psychological doctor. And while there may absolutely be specialty differences, for example, between somebody who's a child, family, school individual, or somebody who works with adults, and then many specializations may break off after there, we believe there's a coherent practice identity of a health service psychologist that carries the identity of a psychological doctor. And that's what combined means for us. There's also integrated, and I should say integrated and pluralistic, across both the paradigms and systematic levels of analysis. So all of us are, if we're clinical psychologists, we know that it's sort of a jungle of different approaches out there. There's cognitive and psychodynamic and humanistic and emotion-focused and behavioral and family systems, not to mention a whole host of other possible perspectives. Our view is that each of these have value, and at the same time, their organization is, well, a bit chaotic, shall we say. So one of our concerns are ways in which we might bring some order and integration across levels of analysis and the paradigms. One example of that is what I call character adaptation systems theory. Character adaptation systems theory is a way to think about the individual through the lenses of three different contexts: the context of one's biophysiological genetic development, that's the lower left arrow, the psychological learning and developmental, and the sociocultural ecological frame that somebody might be involved in. Now, this is something that's very common across a wide variety of different trainings. We see, of course, the biopsychosocial model in at least the United States is a required aspect. But what we also see in this diagram is a way to organize the modes of character adaptation, the systems of adaptation, the systems by which individuals adjust. And my theoretical lens allows me to see the human mind in terms of different systems of adaptation, such as a habit and procedural system, a felt experiential system, a relationship system, a defensive system, and a justification system. And what you can note in relationship to this particular diagram is that actually each of these systems of adaptation correspond to some of the key emphases and insights associated with the major paradigms, most notably the habit and the behavioral system, the humanistic experiential system with the emotion experiential system, psychodynamic focus on our core relational attachments and our defenses, and cognitive and perhaps narrative therapies focus more on the system of justification. So this is just an example about the ways in which our program and our shared sense of understanding appreciates the various viewpoints, recognizes the need for pluralism, and at the same time is looking for ways to integrate across paradigms, across systems and various levels of analysis. And finally, in relationship to unified is in particular at James Madison in terms of, because it's heavily influenced by my work. I was program director there for 12 years. And for us, unified is a focus on how to define the science and practice of psychology at what is known as the metaphysical and meta-theoretical levels of analysis. These are the very big, broad views that we can take. Here is a depiction of what I call the metaphysical empirical continuum. And I've come to see science as absolutely needing attention to all aspects of this particular continuum. You see the right-hand side, you see empirical, which is data gathered by research methods, and those are nested in normal science paradigms, nested in hypothesis and descriptive data techniques. And then there's theory, and that's grounded in a particular paradigm. And that's mostly where our systems operate. The meta-theoretical lens focuses on the relationship between the paradigms and how they might be related. And then finally, the metaphysical lens really emphasizes our concepts and categories. Like, what are the fundamental concepts that we use and how do they interrelate to one another to create what's called a descriptive metaphysical system? That's basically your worldview, your sense of what's real and how you know about it. Now, in my work, I developed a unified theory, what I call the unified theory of psychology. I published this in 2011, and this really was a meta-theoretical analysis in the sense that what it looked at is it examined the various paradigms and then introduced some key ideas that I argued that if we were to begin enter the field through these ideas, we could then take the key insights of the major paradigms and coherently arrange them. I'm currently in the process of developing a book, which will hopefully be done by the summer, called The Problem of Psychology and Its Solution. And that's a metaphysical analysis of the field that gets at the fundamental roots of what our subject matter is concerned with, what is a proper ontology for psychology. So to summarize, we have the combined across the practice areas that give us an identity as psychological doctors, an attitude of integrated pluralism that cuts across the various paradigms in relationship to the theories and levels of analysis and how to coherently arrange them in a particular way that affords us as practitioners, and then fundamentally an attention to the field in relationship to its core concepts and the ways in which the theoretical paradigms relate to each other and the seeking of a coherence amongst those ideas. So what I'd like to share with you in the next 40 minutes or so is some of the narrative associated with this. I'll allude to some of my training and my training in American clinical psychology. I want to emphasize American clinical here because our concepts and categories, one of the things that I attend a lot to is how they exist in systems of justification. They get their meaning in this context, and it's very important for us. And I hope our global consciousness is very much aware of how problematic it can be to transpose a set of concepts that exist in one system of understanding onto another. And I'm very sensitive to that in relationship to what we mean by psychology. What do we mean by the science of psychology? How does that interact with, say, indigenous perspectives? How does it interact with psychological perspectives from other cultures? It is crucial to contextualize the meaning of our terms. And I'll be sharing with you an articulation of my experience in the context of American clinical psychology. And I think it's crucial because actually, in terms of influence, American psychology is some of the most sort of influential, and it's spreading out into the world. And I feel both good and anxious about that, quite frankly. And I think we need to be both aware of what it is and what its potentials are, and also what of its possible problems. And one of the problems that I encountered in my training, which I'm sure all of you encountered in some ways, that I'll speak to, is the problem of psychotherapy. And how that turned into the problem of psychology. And one of my goals of this talk is to really solidify for you what the problem of psychology is. And then I'll offer one aspect of my work in relationship to the problem of psychology and a framework called the Tree of Knowledge system that I developed now over 20 years ago. And how does it set the stage for a new way for us to think about our discipline subject matter and to situate it in a more coherent, naturalistic view of the world that does justice to our souls and spirits in a much more effective way than traditional, at least in my opinion, traditional empirical psychology does. Part of that sets the stage for getting at a core understanding of what our core concepts of. In American psychology, psychology is defined as the science of behavior and mental process. I want to help you at least get a glimpse of some of my work in relationship to understanding these very, very complicated and ill-defined constructs, and how the Tree of Knowledge sets the stage for us to approach these concepts in a new and, I believe, more effective way. I'll then offer some thoughts, shift gears into this sort of abstract, theoretical, metaphysical stuff, and talk about the training that I engage in. So I want everybody to know, although some of my ideas and work does get into pretty high abstract, I'm definitely a theoretical psychologist at heart. I'm also a clinician at heart. My journey started in the clinic room. I'm deeply concerned with human suffering. My work is in training individuals to become effective, reflective, psychological doctors who go into the world with appropriate levels of self-reflection and social responsibility and relation. And I'll talk briefly then ultimately about a unified approach to psychotherapy, how this sets the stage for a particular identity, and the identity of a unified health service psychologist. So now some people will see the word unified and be like, oh, is this, there's one way of doing it. And the answer is no, not at all. In the sense that unified simply means to pay attention to some of the core confusions in the field. And there are ways to resolve those confusions and afford a lot more coherence in our understanding than is present. Once we have coherence, the diversity and integrated pluralism, that is fundamentally the attitude that we're cultivating, because of course, diversity and richness of ideas is actually present in virtually every science. I certainly would want it present in both the science of psychology and its practice, and I would embrace it as a fundamental principle of human existence in relationship to our reaching our potential is found in both the dialectic of unity and diversity. So in terms of my own life, I start with an approach that embraces empirical mainstream psychology. I am impressed by people like Albert Bandura. I'm a social and cognitive psychologist. I say, cognitive behavior therapy, that's empirically supported. I'm really a big fan of that. I also am actually impacted quite a bit by sociology and feminism. I become woke, and I don't know what it means these days, but back in 1989, I know what it meant in relationship to the frame of reference about issues of justice and concern about some historical issues. I was really fortunate to be educated by Rich Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina in community and clinical psychology. I mention these folks because they are pioneers in post-traumatic growth research. Over the last 10 years, this actually caught some fire. You may have heard of post-traumatic growth. I heard that there may be some interest in the power, threat, meaning framework that the Brits are exploring in relation. Actually, some of the post-traumatic growth stuff really offers a very interesting angle on psychopathology. It offers a different angle about what is trauma and how do we think about both suffering and the deepening of human experience. And so I feel very fortunate that I got exposed to that kind of thinking early in my master's degree. Rich Tedeschi was my professor for my integrative psychotherapy class, and this is what sparked in me an awareness of what I would call the problem of psychotherapy. So I'm thinking about science. I want to do sort of the best analytic work. And then, of course, what happens to all of us is you actually get in the clinic room and there's a person in front of you and they're suffering and you're wondering, what the heck am I doing in relationship to this? And how do I intersect my frame of reference for who they are and who I am in this real, unique relationship relative to theories? So I'm in the process then of doing psychotherapy, and I realized, basically what I realized is that, it is my theoretical understanding that is actually going to be a bridge to whatever empirical research people are doing to my actual work in the therapy room. And I see what happens in the therapy room really is there are all sorts of different interesting perspectives. I think they all have some value. And what I also noticed, really the best of the best seem to do the best work. That's not surprising. But what it noted to me is, no, it's not just like CBT is some big winner here. And that's my strong opinion. It's really sort of the best is what the winner is in relationship to what we should be cultivating. And so I went to the University of Vermont for getting my doctorate in clinical psychology. And it's in 1996 that I sort of have what I think turns out to be a very interesting, somewhat common sense idea. And that is, as I saw the work of the different paradigms in the psychotherapy room, I returned to psychology. And I had this idea that actually, why don't we organize the psychotherapy paradigms based on the science of human psychology? Okay. Just like if we look at Western medicine, generally Western medicine is organized on the science of human biology. And although there's all these different specialties, of course, there's a lot of opinion and diverse practice in medicine, but there's also organized around the science of human biology. So shouldn't we then be organizing our psychotherapies in relationship to the human psychology? And then when I returned to human psychology through this particular lens, then I realized just how problematic the structure of of empirical psychology is, and what I became the problem of psychology. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to say, hey, actually, it's our knowledge as psychologists, which actually will be conceptual and explanatory, that will then cause us to draw from empirical research and then put it into the therapy room. However, to the extent that all of the paradigms are disorganized and different people use different frames of reference, the bridge between research and practice is unbelievably chaotic, and it threatens the entire coherence of the system. So fundamentally, what we're talking about then is, what is psychology? And ultimately, what you get is psychology is this, as anyone in the field knows, it's a multiplicity of different meanings. It overlaps some with philosophy and folk experience. In terms of my terminology, I'm referring to modern psychology as a particular enterprise that falls under the scientific sort of language and epistemological system that emerges from Galileo to Newton, and then becomes part of what psychological science emerges as in the 19th century. Now, if you know the history of the science of psychology, it starts off as psychophysics. That is, you change a stimulus out here and somebody notes a just noticeable difference or has an experience on the inside. Wilhelm Wundt, the great German psychologist, finds psychology really studying inner experience based on people's report. William James says, no, that's not what psychology is. Actually, it's the functional relationships of mental life, both on the inside and in relationship to how both animals and humans adapt and adjust. It then bleeds over into philosophical considerations, and this becomes the father of American psychology. Then we get a strong empirical assertion, and John Watson asserting basically we need to follow the experimental natural sciences, and he adopts an epistemology and an ontology of the physical sciences that says, no, we need to look at behavior. Then, of course, we get Mr. Sigmund Freud coming along and basically giving us a whole nother view, also a deterministic view, but nonetheless one that focuses on a very different ontology about both the mind and, of course, the primary focus on the sub or unconscious mind in relationship to the self-conscious mind and its implications for suffering. So what you see here is a wide variety of different phenomena. I could also add a number of perspectives, anywhere from Herbert Ebbinghaus and experimental cognitive to the Gestalt psychology perspective. What actually happens is that even by 1927, Lev Vygotsky, one of the most brilliant psychologists in the field, identifies this as a crisis. There is no coherent ontology. There is no coherent description of what our subject matter is. And fundamentally, this is the problem of psychology. Now, what did modern empirical, mostly American psychology do? Well, basically, it said, don't worry about it. It's like, we're going to be a science, okay? And as long as we're a science, we will add to our knowledge through the empirical enterprise. And yes, there will be a pluralistic of investigation. Now, a thoughtful student will come on and say, hey, how can it be a science if it can't define its terms? And basically what modern science said, well, it's okay. And this is what I'm going to critique about the field. It's not okay. And I'm going to argue that essentially what is happening is what I call the sandcastle problem. The sandcastle problem is, I believe that there are a multitude of different research programs, and I think they're brilliant and they're beautiful, but at the same time, they're defined in a particular operationalized way. And while you can build sandcastles, what will happen is the tide of the next researchers will come in, and that will wash those sandcastles out, and then a new group will grow. But what will not happen, and Paul Meehl noted this, what will not happen is a cumulative knowledge structure. And so what I believe is the foundation, it can be seen in terms of our problems, is to start with our basic definitions and take a look at those. So let's see how the field is defined. So some individuals, 5 to 10% in American psychology, at least say that psychology is the science of behavior. There's still very respectable textbooks that make this claim. And the reason that psychology is the science of behavior is because that behavior is what's studied by science. And therefore, that's what psychological scientists should be interested in. And then we get other people that say, no, psychology is not about the science of behavior. It's about the science of mind. Okay. So notice right off the bat, we have a fundamentally different ontological or descriptive claim about what our subject matter is to this day. Of course, it's worth noting that you also have now the emergence of cognitive science. What is the relationship between cognitive science and psychology? That's an interesting question. But if we're going to be a scientist, we still have the problem of why the behaviorists made the claim they do. And many cognitive psychologists will say, well, yes, I am interested in the mind, but I study the mind via the behavior. In fact, every psychological scientist, this is a quote from George Mandler that basically says, well, we're all behaviorists in the sense that we study behavior, but we interpret it as a mind, unlike the behaviorists. So what do? Most of the field basically then decides to, well, we'll go with mind and behavior. That sounds reasonable. And so in fact, about 80% of the dominant textbooks define psychology as the science of both mind and behavior. David Myers has a common textbook, the behavior and mental process. That's actually probably the most common definition. And I thought I'd share a definition by Rosie Spellman in a psychological book. Word psychology is coined at a time when concepts like soul and mind were not clearly distinguished. Okay, well, that's a whole nother problem, right? We got soul, and that's ultimately the root of psyche. But then we're really interested in mind. But here's the key element. Since science studies only observable phenomena and the mind is not directly observable, we expand this definition to the scientific study of mind and behavior. Okay. And this actually nails what modern empirical psychology does, but it really highlights, I believe, for us, what we have done then, just for clarity, is we've used the epistemology of science, meaning the way in which science knows, to dictate how we define our subject matter. And so psychologists split behavior and mental processes off from each other, where behavior gets defined by what we can assess directly in science, and then mental processes are what we can infer as a function of the epistemological constrictions that science places on us. Now, this actually is a very, very problematic approach to defining one's subject matter, to go ahead and define it by the method, okay? I want to say that we've been grappling with this issue for, almost 100 years, if not more, really. And we have to ask, why is this so hard? Why is this such a complicated thing? And actually, as I've gotten more and more interested in theory and then philosophy, I think I found basically we can actually look outside and understand modernity and understand the way modernity makes sense out of it and see why this is so hard. And I generated the term called the enlightenment gap to explain why actually it makes perfect sense that psychology would have such difficulty in defining what its terms is. What is the enlightenment gap? Well, the enlightenment gap refers to two fundamental philosophical problems. In other words, two problems that we really don't know how to address. One of the problems is understanding, having a basic ontological or explanatory frame for what is mind relative to matter. We don't have a good framework for that. And secondarily, we don't have a good framework really for understanding what social knowledge is and how is it relative, but also different from scientific knowledge, or the reverse. What is scientific knowledge? How did it emerge out of, and how is it different than social knowledge? How do we know that these are problems? Actually, you can just look out at the landscape. For example, what we see is the mind-body problem. It's everywhere in philosophy. In the West, we can trace it to René Descartes, who gives us a mind-body dualism. Virtually every philosopher agrees that mind-body dualism is really problematic, and yet we still don't have a good language or grammar to put mind-body together. So one obvious factor is we don't have the right field of understanding to define our terms. So that's the mind-matter problem. What about the science and social knowledge? Well, those of you that have any conversations about modernism versus postmodernism will know, here's a Michel Foucault notion: power is everywhere, it's diffused and embodied in discourse. And this issue gets to the authority of knowledge, the nature of truth claims that's embedded in immanent context or is transcendent and speaks to reality in a particular way. So here's an idea. If we can't define what scientific knowledge is relative to social knowledge, and we can't define what mind is relative to matter, no doubt that we're going to have serious problems in relationship to defining our field. And so what I would then posit is, if we take a step back, why is the problem of psychology so difficult? Well, actually, it's even a part of a larger problem where the problem of psychology is actually in the shadow of the enlightenment gap. And so it's fundamental to our basic sense-making structures. And so that's one of the points that I would then really like to say, is that modernity never really figured out a way to talk about matter and mind and to understand what scientific knowledge is in relationship to social knowledge. And if that's the case, how could we possibly have a science of mind and behavior? Because both of those things will conflate and bounce up against each other, and different people are then going to have different frames of reference. So we have a core fundamental metaphysical or epistemological, ontological problems. I'll be clear about these terms. So the epistemology refers to how do we know, and psychology is trying to get an understanding of the psyche, which could be whatever that might mean. But one thing it certainly probably means has to do with consciousness. However, consciousness is not available through an exterior epistemology, but behavior is. Consciousness is available from the inside. So this creates an epistemological problem. So whereby the inside's dependent upon, the inner consciousness is dependent upon an interior epistemological view, but science is dependent upon an exterior view. There also is an ontological problem. What is the ontological problem? Well, there are two aspects of the ontological problem. One is called the hard problem. Philosophers discuss this a lot. You may have heard, what's the hard problem of consciousness? Well, that's the difficulty in explaining subjective conscious experience based in material terms. And I'm not going to talk about that. But one thing that they don't talk about in relationship to the problem of psychology is the ontological problem, is that we psychologists have then gone ahead and developed many different paradigms to define mental and behavioral processes in many different ways. I've already reviewed some of these. So we have mind as behavior, because that's what's available through science. Then we can build models of behavior. Mind as information processing. There's a whole really neurocognitive functionalism is arguably the most basic understanding of psychology. There's mind as your conscious experience of being. There's mind as self-conscious reflection, and there's some people that argue that mind should only be for human self-conscious reflection. That would go back to Rene Descartes' conception of mind. And we also have serious questions about whether or not we're talking at the level of the animal or at the level of the human. And what does this mean? Basically, what we're talking about here is these are very different reference points in reality. So to this day, we do not have a zoomed out view that allows us to correspond these very different reference points. And if we have radically different ontological reference points for what we're talking about, we will ultimately kind of create mush in our understanding, or at least there's a tremendous vulnerability to what my friend John Vervaeke calls equivocation across explanatory frames. And this is one of the things that has driven my own passion, is this notion that there's no agreement. I wish that the problem of psychology was widely known and discussed. There's a problem of quantum gravity in physics. Everyone knows about it. But I'm trying to get people to raise their awareness that there is a foundational problem here. And we should wonder about what it actually means and if there are viable solutions. And this takes me back then to my own timeline. And in my doctoral training, I sort of had a transition into viewing the world that then ultimately set the stage so that I built what I argue to then be a naturalist scientific ontology that's actually up to the task of defining behavior and mental process. One key idea was the justification system idea. I actually started that in 1996. What that does, and I'm not going to get into any details there, is it really separates out our culture person part of our mind from our primate part of our mind. And those are very, very different. And will be an argument that I will make is that there's a primate part meaning of our mind and a person part of our mind. And it's crucial to understand why and what is the relationship between those two domains. And that relates then to what would ultimately become the overall map, what I call the tree of knowledge system. That occurred in a flash of insight back in 1997. It was really interesting to me. A year later, Edward Wilson's Consilience came out, and really, my basic frame of reference is that the tree of knowledge affords us a path into consilience. Indeed, I characterize my overarching system as a unified theory of knowledge in relationship that would be very much akin to Wilson's hypothesis about consilience. I argue Wilson fails at consilience because he doesn't even address the problem of psychology, and there would be no way to achieve consilience if you don't understand and deconstruct and resolve the problem of psychology. So in 2003, I did publish the Tree of Knowledge System in the Theoretical Unification of Psychology. It's also important or worth noting that my day job during this time is at the University of Pennsylvania, and I work with Dr. Aaron Beck, and we were running a randomized controlled clinical trial. And this also had a tremendous impact on me and how I understood how the paradigms would frame what the experience was on the ground. And while we certainly did some really interesting work, it's also the case, I'll tell you front end as the project director, the complexity of the cases and the ways in which we work from far exceeded cognitive therapy's capacity really to frame it. Yet because that was the paradigm that we were operating under, then virtually all the results were then framed and interpreted, even in the Journal of American Medical Association, the high-level scientific journal. But in fact, I would argue that it was not the full picture, to say the absolute, to say the least, in relationship. So this was one of my concerns in relationship to how do we actually do research and have conceptual categories that are up to the task. So what is this tree of knowledge system? Like I said, it's a naturalistic scientific ontology that I believe can define behavior and mental processes. This is a part of the work that I'm currently doing in my book. If you're familiar at all with the system, if you know big history at all, which if you don't, I really encourage. Big history is the idea that we can really pull together a big naturalistic view of the world. If we go back on the scale of time and down on the scale of complexity, and then we can then come back, and that means we start our universe origin story at the Big Bang as a state of energy information. And then out of that emerges the dimension, the material dimension of complexity. The base of that material dimension is the quantum mechanical base, and then across scale, and to explain the sort of shape of the universe and its relationship, the space-time relationship to gravity and mass is afforded by general relativity. And then we can go up scales of complexification from particles into atoms, into complex chemical molecules, and then across scale, like up into planets and asteroids and stars, and ultimately galaxies along those lines. So that's the first dimension or plane of existence. The tree of knowledge then says there's a second plane of existence that emerges about 3.8 billion years ago, at least that we're aware of, on planet Earth. And then over the course of a 3 billion year period, we see the emergence of the tree of life. This happens as a function of natural selection operating on genetic combinations that give rise to cells, and cells then evolve, connect with each other, create multicellular creatures, and we see the emergence of the tree of life. And then the tree of knowledge makes an interesting claim that says we see another dimension of complexity emerging around what's called the Cambrian explosion. This is when we get complex active animals. A complex active animal's got a complex body with segments. It has a brain, and something like an insect would be a complex active body. And then we see the evolution about 550 million years from the Cambrian explosion, up then into invertebrates like insects and crabs, and then up into vertebrates like fish, and then birds, and then ultimately primates. And this we can also model through an emergent variation, selection, and retention model and neuroinformation processing that's very akin to genetics. Now, importantly, I'm introducing a word to our vocabulary here called mind with a capital M. It's now akin to life, and it refers to the dimension of animal mental behavior. This is one of the, it's not a neologism in the sense that I'm not completely making up a word. I can show references that people use, but it is a particular meaning of mind that then when you actually capture it, it then affords us a new way to think about the relationship between inside, outside activity and the nervous system as a whole that's going to get us out of defining things based in terms of scientific methodology. But it's important to note that the first then dimension that we're talking about in mind is the animal mental dimension. And then the tree of knowledge says there's a fourth dimension that emerges between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago. What happens is our symbolic language systems really take off, and we start talking in propositional language. Propositional language changes the game, and it changes the game because it creates the problem of justification. What is legitimately is and ought to be the case, both in an analytic sense and a social and personal sense. And then all of a sudden we get into dialogue, question and answer dialogue, and then we build systems of justification. And we see the evolution both of our knowledge systems and then, especially in the last 10,000 years, our technological systems as we gain greater and greater control. This is another emergent evolutionary process with the fundamental unit being then symbols that are then organized into propositional statements that give rise to these networks of justification. It's also important to note here that it's culture with a capital C. I very much believe other animals have little c culture, but capital C culture refers to culture where people are coordinated, self-conscious people coordinated by systems of justification. And although other animals are very advanced, they do not have this very unique capacity, which makes us a very different kind of primate. So we get the tree of knowledge system then affords us a new and I think better map of big history. It defines the natural universe, the ontic natural universe through matter, life, mind, and culture. And then it starts the process of potentially organizing our scientific knowledge and corresponding to that. One of the things about it is that it then has these joint points. Unfortunately, time limitations means that I won't be able to tell you exactly about the meta-theoretical structures. I've written a lot about them, but they do afford then a way to then pull paradigms, models of understanding these domains together to create a big picture of coherence. So fundamentally, so how does the system work? I'm going to share then the basic vision logic of the system is that you have physics mapping the matter dimension, you have biology mapping the life dimension. Then the current knowledge system is basically chaotic. As you get more and more higher on the scales of complexification, that's somewhere in there psychology is about. In American psychology, you can really see the most influential, but also basically polar opposite figures in radical behaviorism and B.F. Skinner and Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. I chose those figures early on to show that I can assimilate and integrate them with each other and mainstream psychology. And then we can move from this confused set of ideas to a system that has a lot more coherence in relation, ultimately arguing that through behavioral investment theory, I can bring Skinner in accordance with emergent evolutionary theory, and then I can connect Freud to the shift from primate to persons, and then create a physical, biological, psychological, social picture of the whole. This is crucial. One of the things that it speaks to in relationship to what is psychology is that when we talk about mental processes and behavior, the logic and architecture of the tree of knowledge says we should define the science of psychology in very different ways, whether we're talking about basic psychology. Basic psychology is brain, mind, animal behavior studies. And then there's human psychology, which would be a totally different subdiscipline, precisely because humans are both primates and they're persons that are socialized in particular ways that fundamentally change the behavior and mental processes, which is why humans have conferences and other animals do not seem to. So that is a sort of a taste to suggest that we could be in a position to use the tree of knowledge to define our terms. And that's what I would like to argue for in the next brief period of this talk. And one of the things that I'd like to suggest is that the tree of knowledge highlights something very important about the concept of behavior. It says, actually, the behaviors were sort of right and they were very wrong in some ways. They were sort of right in that science, yes, is about behavior. They were very wrong to then say psychology was about behavior. Because if science is about behavior, then that's going to have to mean that psychology has to be a particular kind of behavior. And that's a very, very different argument to make. So one of the things that I want to suggest then is that science in general does frame the universe in behavioral terms. There's an observer, there's an object field change that the observer measures. That is a scientific epistemological stance about all positions. In other words, behavior then becomes the goggles through an exterior epistemology where it defines the observer looking through a change in object field. And that is important because when we now go to the tree of knowledge, we say, oh, actually, behavior can be organized in relationship to the different dimensions of complexity. And actually, I'll take that a step further with this periodic table of behavior. What the periodic table of behavior suggests is that we're going to organize different dimensions of behavior, matter, life, mind, and culture. That gives us general object field relations. And then there are these primary levels of analysis. And actually, when you look at nature this way and you look at the sciences, you get to see that the sciences actually are organized around these different dimensions and these different levels of analysis. So there's energy that then goes into particle physics, and then that goes into atomic physics, like the periodic table, and then that gets into chemistry, and then that goes into scale, like I mentioned, like earth science. Then you jump over and you get to molecular biology and genetics. Then you get into cytology, the science of cells, and multi-organism science like botany. And then you go across scale there and you get into ecology. And then it gets confusing in terms of our terms, but I want to say we then get into neuroscience, and then we get into animal behavioral science, which I want to call comparative psychology or basic psychology. In America, it's called ethology, which is this weird blend between biology and psychology. And then you have the social behavioral ecology of groups. And then finally, that jumps over and we get the emergence of propositional language and self-conscious justification, and then we get into family. So why is this model important? Well, it shows the stratification of nature that's available when we look through our behavioral glasses. But what it means is that fundamentally there are these different classes of behavior. And that sets up the stage for a very interesting argument that says, well, physics is about the material behaviors and biology is about the living behaviors. Now psychology basic psychology becomes about mental behaviors, and then human psychology becomes about, well, human mental behaviors that are embedded in a cultural context. So now what we have is, well, what is behavior? Behavior now takes on a completely different meaning. Whereas before behavior gets defined by the epistemological requirements of science, here we have a broad ontological view about what behavior is, and then we classify it. And what pops in relationship to this is that there are certain kinds of behaviors that psychologists are interested in. So with behaviors defined as such, this brings us to an opportunity to then say, well, what do we mean by mental process? If I had more time, I would elaborate what are the various different meanings and references, but I will simply say that some people mean mind as the neuroinformation processing, other people mean it in terms of this subjective conscious experience of being, and a subset of individuals mean it in terms of our self-conscious, reflective, dialogical discussion and talk, like in terms of human reasoning. What these three different domains of mind can be mapped onto are different reference now with this map that have different epistemological views. So there's mind sub 1, that's the neurocognitive analysis. Mind sub 2, that is the subjective conscious phenomenology, and then mind 3. And what's interesting about this table is that it suggests that actually, yes, these are different domains of mental process on the one hand, and they're available through different epistemological frames. One is the classic behavioral epistemological frame. The second is a subjective phenomenological frame. The third is actually an intersubjective frame because it's dependent upon the capacity for one to observe one speaking, a verbal behavior, if you want to use the old behaviorist term. But of course, that requires then an observer that actually speaks the language and comprehends the systems of justification that are being advocated for. What does this mean? It ultimately sets the stage then for us to address psychology's fundamental problem, where we have consciousness that is historically defined by the interior epistemology of science versus behavior. And now we can say, actually, there's mind 1, which is functional awareness and response, mind 2, which is phenomenology, and mind 3. And these then have different frames of reference in relationship to exterior epistemology, which is anchored in behavior, but includes overt reactions and somewhat neurocognitive process, and public verbal talk, self-report. And then there's interior epistemology, which is centered in subjective experience and also involves a private narrator. Why is this fundamentally useful? Well, ultimately, it gives rise to what I call the map of mind 1, 2, 3. The map of mind 1, 2, 3 enables us to define exterior and interior epistemology. First, the neurocognitive functionalism mediated by the nervous system. And then we have mind in terms of overt behavior, what the animal is doing. We have the subjective conscious experience. There's a theory, behavioral investment theory, that unites these various domains and shows how they engage in informational interface. And then finally, private and public justification. So now what this does is it then says, oh, what do we mean by behavior on the one hand, writ large, and then what do we mean by the domains of mental process and how are they interconnected? This allows us then to define mind as behavior, that's mind 1B, mind as cognition, mind 1A, mind as phenomenology, mind 2, and ultimately mind as self-conscious, both private and public. So now what we have is we don't have to be defined by the methods of science, but we actually can be defined by a naturalistic ontology and see what other reference point people have, and ultimately it gives rise to a unified ontology. Now my argument is that is a game changer when it comes to thinking about the science of psychology. And if we go back to where I began in relationship to my work in the clinic room, all of this very, very, kind of crazy abstract reflection in relationship to what are these deep concepts starts with the concern in the clinic room. And ultimately, I'd like to then bring us back to my work in the combined integrated program and share a little bit about what that fundamentally is about. And what I'm trying to leave you with is this idea that there are these different domains of fragmentation, and some of the work we're doing does seem to be able to put these very disparate domains together in a way that affords coherence. So the combined integrated doctoral training program at James Madison, fundamentally what we call the Madison model, is about training doctoral level health service psychologists or psychological doctors. The program is designed as an integrative applied professional psychology that seeks to train leaders in mental health. In fact, what we're trying to invite individuals to come into our program is to look out at the landscape and ask, well, what do we mean by mental illness? How are we treating? What are the cultural implications? What are the biological? What are the developmental implications? How do we understand systems, and how do we do it with philosophical reflection and scientific clarity and good, responsible practice in the new systems that we might enter? The mission is to produce leading professional psychologists that are broadly trained in the science and practice of psychology. We cultivate an active level of self-reflection, because I certainly believe that clinicians have to understand where their beliefs come from. We have to be reflective in relationship to what is our ideology, our worldview, our value structure, what is our particular triggers, and how do those intersect with the different rich and complicated and often dysfunctional psychological systems that we enter. We then want to cultivate individuals who are optimally prepared to work in a wide variety of settings with diverse clientele. And we believe that this is a professional, fundamental, ethical responsibility. And when we cultivate personal, social, and global awareness and a sense of contributing to the greater good, and fundamentally then reflectiveness about what that actually means and how it becomes embodied in our lives. The program was sparked before I got there by the recognition of the increasing complexity of human psychological needs require a comprehensive and integrative approach to fostering psychological well-being. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it offers this unique view of small c clinical and also small c counseling and small c school, and cultivates a particular in the center of the heart of a psychological doctor. The vision of the program actually was recently adopted in 2017 by the American Psychological Association. In fact, if you encounter the term health service psychology is defined by the intersecting and central overlap of clinical, school, and counseling. And by the way, that actually came from the leadership of our program back in 2003, when we hosted some conferences and set the stage for delineating this aspect of professional practice. The rationale is that we can integrate synergistically across, and we don't need to break. I mean, what does it mean to be a counseling psychologist versus a clinical psychologist in the 21st century? I appreciate and deeply the counseling tradition, but I also will argue that in terms of the identity of what it means in relationship to the field, it behooves us enormously to have a consolidated professional identity around a generalist orientation. And I believe that in a global and international context, that makes good sense, although each system, as I say, depends enormously on the institutional cultural dynamics. Very briefly, because I'm aware of time here, the system then that I offer does allow us to share a picture of the institution of American psychology. And what you see here is that you have basic psychology, the three great branches, sort of animal, mind, brain, behavior. You then have individual into social and cultural psychology. These are the scientific disciplines. Then that's organized into professional practice. There's applied psychological bridges and the fundamental domains of competence and ethical commitments that define the field. So I believe that the system that I afford sets the stage, at least in the context of American psychology, to take the 50 plus divisions and actually place them in coherent relation. The program has a number of goals, and fundamentally, basically what we want to do is we want to create a sensibility of a unified professional psychologist who understands both the coherence of the science and its enormous plurality, appreciate the research, and appreciate the craft of entering into consultation, assessment, and intervention systems. I'm not going to read these particular professional goals. They speak to all of the issues that I mentioned. This goal 4 speaks to our appreciation and richness of human diversity and diverse contexts in which people operate. And goal 5 focuses on the program leveraging its privilege in relationship to making a difference for the better in other systems, and do so with humility and honor the integrity and dignity of other systems. The last section that I would like to just briefly speak about is embedded in this is this idea that there is a unified or integrative approach to psychotherapy and a subset of integrative. I'm actually president-elect of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. The Society for Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration is an established professional frame for thinking deeply about integrative approaches. I would argue that when we look broadly, there are 7 major approaches that we should be thinking about: the biopsychiatric, biomedical, evolutionary. Then there are these major individual approaches. And then fundamentally, there's social family systems, feminist, critical theory kinds of perspectives that need to be considered as we reflect on the work that we do. As you know, and as I began with, it gives us the choice in relationship to what do we do? Do we go to one of the paradigms and just hang out on a particular mountain? The psychotherapy integration people argue, no, there are these different paths: common factors, technical eclecticism, as a theoretical integration. They have different focuses. Common factors emphasizes the relationship and says it really doesn't matter what you call it, it's all about the process. You can then go technical eclecticism that focuses on the particular domains of intervention and says, hey, what works empirically? You get then assimilative integration that says, hey, you can have a home, but look and utilize the perspectives of others. And then there's theoretical integration, which says, hey, we can pull key insights, say, from learning theory and psychodynamic theory and blend them together to make a better model. All of these have value. I've studied them all deeply. I teach psychotherapy integration. I am a particular fan of a 5th pathway, and that's this unification pathway. And what it does is that there are ways, I believe, to build meta models. I should introduce you to one that afford us the opportunity to see the mountain range and then organize the key insights in relation and suggest that each of the paradigms is playing a particular instrument. If we try to listen at all at once with no frame, we get a lot of noise. However, if we step back at the right place and see the mountain range, we can then pull each instrument and see them in relation, and then we can elucidate a much more musical sense, a musically coherent sense of what the field is speaking to us. And then there are, as I mentioned when I opened, and again, I would have spent a day on exploring character adaptation systems theory and what does it mean for how do you conceptualize and then how do you intervene in real situations in relationship to the therapy. But what I would like to do is end today in relationship to the cultivation of what we talk about in terms of a unified health service psychologist. I practice as a psychological doctor who's trained broadly in the science of human psychology, especially personality, relationships, development, psychopathology, and human change processes in the context of therapy to foster psychological adjustment and more optimal psychological functioning for individuals in need of care. To do this, I engage in a comprehensive assessment that examines key domains of function: habits, lifestyles, emotions, emotional functioning, relationships and interpersonal styles, defenses, coping, and identity, and psychosocial well-being, both in terms of psychiatric diagnoses and maladaptive processes and problems associated with living, problems in living in distress. These elements are placed in a biological, learning, developmental, and sociocultural context to delineate a clear case conceptualization and problem formulation. The results in a treatment plan, which is developed in collaboration with the client from a menu of bona fide interventions that might be appropriate, taking into considerations their values, level of functioning, and stage of change. Through a strong working alliance and a process of awareness, acceptance, and active change, skill development efforts, the therapy is oriented toward meeting appropriate goals, which are set relative to prognosis based on the conceptualization and problem formulation. Progress towards those goals and the quality of the relationship is monitored, and if successful, we turn to maintenance and ultimately, when appropriate, termination. So fundamentally, this is, and I hope this speaks to a wide variety of you in the type of work that you do. And that's what I wanted to extend as I bring this to a close, is the idea that there is an opportunity for a rich, textured, skilled craft of a psychological doctor, but one that actually is informed by a particular frame of reference that has more coherence. So fundamentally, combine across the practice areas, integrate across the systems and paradigms, unified the field, and then cultivate a unified identity as psychological doctor. That's combined, integrated, unified. Thank you so much for the time and the attention and the opportunity to share these ideas with you. So.